A woman who taught the greatest minds of her age was seized from her carriage in broad daylight, humiliated in a church, and brutally silenced before her remains were destroyed in the streets. This was no anonymous victim of mob violence. This was Hypatia of Alexandria, the most celebrated philosopher and mathematician of the Roman Empire. Murdered in March 415 CE by men who called themselves servants of God, her death was not the result of spontaneous rage, but a calculated act of political violence that would silence one of the last great voices of classical philosophy. In Alexandria, where Greek learning had flourished for 7 centuries, the brutal killing of this extraordinary woman marked the moment when religious authority finally crushed the tradition of open intellectual inquiry that had defined the ancient world. Hypatia's authority in pagan Alexandria. In the late 4th century, Alexandria remained what it had been for generations, the intellectual heart of the Mediterranean world. The city's famed museum and library might have declined from their former glory, but the tradition of learning they represented still commanded reverence throughout the empire. At the center of this world stood Hypatia, daughter of Theon of Alexandria, himself a distinguished mathematician and the last recorded member of the Alexandrian Museum. She had inherited more than her father's position. She had inherited his mission to preserve Greek mathematical and philosophical knowledge in increasingly hostile times. Hypatia taught in the Neoplatonist tradition, following the philosophy of Plotinus rather than the more mystical interpretations that had gained favor elsewhere. Her school focused on the pursuit of truth through reason and mathematical precision. The historian Socrates, Scholasticus, writing within a generation of her death, described her as surpassing all the philosophers of her time in both literature and science. Students traveled from distant provinces to hear her lectures on mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy. She explained the works of Diophantus on arithmetic and Apollonius on conic sections, subjects that required years of disciplined study to master. What made Hypatia truly exceptional in her world was not just her intellect, but also her public authority. She moved freely through Alexandria's streets, appearing before magistrates and civic officials without the constraints that typically limited women's roles. Socrates, Scholasticus, noted that she possessed a self-assurance and dignity that came from the cultivation of her mind, and that men admired her all the more for it. She never married, dedicating herself entirely to philosophy and teaching. Her students included both pagans and Christians, among them Caius of Cyrene, who would become Bishop of Tomis while maintaining his deep respect for his former teacher. By the early 5th century, Hypatia had become more than a teacher. She served as an advisor to Alexandria's political elite, including the Roman prefect Orestes, who governed Egypt on behalf of the emperor in Constantinople. Her home became a gathering place for the city's educated class, where philosophical discussions mixed with political counsel. In a city increasingly defined by religious conflict, Hypatia represented something that was rapidly disappearing. A space where learning mattered more than sectarian loyalty, where pagan and Christian could study together without violence. Serial supporters mark Hypatia for death. When Cyril became Patriarch of Alexandria in 412 CE, he brought with him a vision of Christian authority that left no room for compromise. His appointment had been controversial, and he moved quickly to consolidate power by targeting those he saw as threats to Christian dominance. Unlike his predecessor, Theophilus, who had maintained a working relationship with Alexandria's educated pagans, Cyril viewed the city's religious diversity as an obstacle to be eliminated rather than managed. His first major confrontation came with Alexandria's Jewish community. In 414 CE, following violence between Christians and Jews, Cyril led a mob that seized the synagogues, confiscated Jewish property, and drove many Jews from the city. The Roman prefect Orestes was horrified. As the emperor's representative, he was responsible for maintaining order and protecting all citizens regardless of religion. He sent an angry report to Constantinople condemning Cyril's actions and demanding imperial intervention. The conflict between patriarch and prefect escalated rapidly. Cyril summoned 500 monks from the monasteries of Nitria, the desert region where he himself had trained. These monks descended on Alexandria and confronted Orestes in the streets, surrounding him as he rode through the city and publicly accusing him of paganism. When the arrested insisted he had been baptized by the Bishop of Constantinople, one of the monks threw a stone that struck his forehead, causing him injury. His guards abandoned him in fear, but a crowd of Alexandrians rushed to protect him and captured the attacker, a monk named Ammonius. Orestes ordered Ammonius subjected to fatal punishment as a penalty for assaulting the emperor's representative. Cyril responded by declaring the dead monk a martyr, giving him a church funeral, and renaming him Thracius, meaning the Wonderful. The message was unmistakable. Those who attacked the prefect were not criminals, but holy warriors, deserving of veneration. Even many Christians in Alexandria found this grotesque, recognizing that Ammonius had been killed for attempting murder, not for his faith. But Cyril's supporters understood what their patriarch was telling them. In this poisoned atmosphere, Hypatia became the focal point of Cyril's faction's rage. She was Orestes' most visible advisor, a pagan philosopher whose influence over the prefect seemed to them the only explanation for his refusal to submit to ecclesiastical authority. Rumors began spreading through the Christian community that Hypatia had bewitched Orestes through sorcery, that she practiced magic, and that she used her unnatural learning to keep the prefect alienated from the church. To Cyril's supporters, the power this woman wielded made no sense unless it came from demonic forces. The truth was simpler and more threatening to Cyril's ambitions. Hypatia represented the old Alexandrian tradition that placed intellectual achievement above religious identity and valued wisdom wherever it could be found. Her very existence contradicted everything Cyril was trying to build. A pagan woman advising the prefect, teaching Christian students, and commanding the respect of the city's elite. This could not be tolerated if Christian authority was to be absolute. The Parabellini execute Hypatia in public. The men who killed Hypatia called themselves Parabellini, a name derived from the Greek word for those who risk their lives. Originally organized to care for the sick and dying, these lay attendants to the patriarch had been transformed under Cyril into something far darker. Drawn from Alexandria's lower classes, they functioned as the patriarch's private militia, numbering perhaps 800 men who could be mobilized at any moment to advance the church's interests through intimidation and violence. The Parabellini had already proven their usefulness to Cyril's cause. They had participated in the expulsion of the Jews, destroyed pagan temples, and created an atmosphere of terror that kept potential opposition silent. Their official role as caregivers gave them access throughout the city and a veneer of charitable purpose that masked their true function as enforcers of religious conformity. When Cyril needed force applied, the Parabellini provided it. On March 4, 15 CE, during the season of Lent, a group of these men ambushed Hypatia as she returned home from delivering her daily lectures. Their leader was Peter, a lector who read scripture in church services, a minor cleric, but one with enough authority to organize and command a mob. They forcibly removed her from her chariot in one of Alexandria's main streets and forced her to ward the Caesareum, the massive structure that had once been a temple dedicated to the Roman imperial cult. Cyril had claimed this building as his headquarters, transforming it into a Christian church. Inside the Caesareum, the Parabellini forcibly removed Hypatia's clothing. They struck her with astraca, the sharp fragments of pottery and roof tiles that lay scattered throughout any ancient city. Socrates, Scholasticus, the Christian historian who documented these events, described how they killed her with these crude implements. The violence was deliberate and prolonged. They fatally wounded her body, ending the life of one of the greatest minds of her generation. When they finished, they carried what remained of Hypatia through the streets to a place called Sinon and burned her there. The entire sequence, the public abduction, the execution in Cyril's own church, the fatal attack, and the burning followed the traditional Alexandrian method for disposing of the most violent criminals. It was a ritualized act of civic purification, a statement that Hypatia was not just an enemy, but a pollutant that had to be eradicated from the city. No one was arrested. No one was punished. The Parabolani returned to their ordinary duties as if nothing had happened. Cyril made no statement condemning the murder. His silence spoke clearly enough. The killing had occurred under his authority in his church by his men, and he approved. The following year, Emperor Theodosius II and his co-emperor Honorius issued an edict attempting to restrict the Parabolani. Their numbers were reduced to 500, and they were forbidden from attending public spectacles or entering courtrooms. The edict explicitly mentioned the terror they had caused, but the restrictions proved temporary. Within 2 years, Cyril regained control of the Parabolani, and the emperor's attempt to curtail their power collapsed. The patriarch had won. Hypatia's murder sent tremors through what remained of the classical intellectual world. For centuries, philosophers had been considered untouchable, even during the violent upheavals that periodically shook Roman cities. The principle that learning commanded respect, regardless of religious affiliation, had been one of the few constants in an empire increasingly divided by doctrinal disputes. That principle died with Hypatia in the Caesareum. Within months of her death, scholars began abandoning Alexandria, seeking refuge in Athens or Constantinople, anywhere that seemed safer than the city that had once been synonymous with learning itself. The Neoplatonic school that she had led continued, but it would never again command the authority it had possessed when she taught there. What does Hypatia's death reveal about the relationship between power and knowledge when religious authority becomes absolute? The charred remnants in Sinon marked more than the end of one woman's life. They marked the closing of an era when it was still possible to believe that wisdom could transcend the boundaries of faith. That truth could be pursued without seeking permission from those who claimed to speak for